Next, highlight the road to Japan. Highlight the bold term island hopping. Make sure you know this. So the territories that the Japanese had taken in the Pacific, they weren't huge chunks of land. They were tiny little islands. So the island hopping was a plan to literally jump from island to island. They'd conquer one important island, use that as a base to jump to the next important island. Highlight General MacArthur. Highlight that he was fighting the Japanese in New Guinea. Highlight Admiral William Halsey and that he was fighting for the Solomons. And highlight Admiral Chester Nimitz and highlight that he was the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet and that he was concentrating his forces to crack the Japanese Empire. So we've got kind of the three main leaders in the Pacific here. They often did not like each other, but they were forced to work together. There was a lot of ego to come together in one room. All of them were very powerful men, both in their personalities and in the positions that they held. So they were an interesting dynamic, but they were able to overcome their differences and win the war in the Pacific. Highlight fight in murky swamps, dense jungles, sharp coral rocks. Highlight insects and dangerous tropical diseases. Highlight a little further down crocodiles and sharks. These were just a few of the natural obstacles that the soldiers and Marines had to overcome here. Highlight the italicized words, the Japanese absolutely refused to surrender. They believed it was their sacred duty to defend their homeland to the death. Highlight this, to surrender would bring the ultimate dishonor. So a lot of them would actually commit suicide rather than surrender. They'd either shoot themselves, they'd fall on their saber, or even some of them were jumping off cliffs into the sea in order to avoid being taken. So in all, very few Japanese prisoners were actually taken. Next, highlight the Gilberts. Highlight Tarawa. This was a very important campaign here. With Tarawa, the Americans would have an air base from which they could bomb Japanese positions in the Marshall and Caroline Islands. Before the amphibious assault, Admiral Nimitz's ships and planes bombarded the islands. But they very much underestimated just how fortified the Japanese were. So when the Marines landed, they were still forced to fight the fanatical Japanese to the very last man. On the top of the next page, highlight, there were 4,800 enemy troops and civilian workers. Only 147 were taken alive. Next, highlight the Marianas. Highlight June and July 1944. Highlight Saipan. Highlight the Mariana Islands. These were in range of both the Japanese mainland and the Philippines, so very key here. Highlight the troops landed on Saipan on June 15th, and that the fighting ended in July. The last groups of Japanese soldiers made suicide attacks straight into American machine gun fire. So they just charged the machine gun positions knowing that they were inevitably going to die. Next, highlight the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Highlight that the Japanese lost 4 aircraft carriers and 400 planes. With the seizure of Guam and Tinian in July, American forces then securely possessed the Marianas. And with these secure, American engineers could prepare airfields, and B-29 Super Fortress bombers could begin daily air raids on Japanese cities. And with this, they were able to destroy much of Japan's war production. Next, highlight New Guinea. Highlight, in the summer of 1942, General MacArthur established a base at Port Moresby. On the next column, highlights, by the early fall of 1944, MacArthur was within striking distance of the Philippines. Next, highlight return to the Philippines. highlight airstrikes, and highlight eliminating many Japanese ships and planes. So these airstrikes were led by Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet. Allied forces landed on Peleliu Island and Morotai Island, west and south of Mindanao. And these successes led General MacArthur and Admiral Halsey to change plans, and they decided to land on the eastern side of Leyte Island. So highlight the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Highlight that it was one of the greatest naval battles in history, and that the Japanese lost almost all of their remaining ships and planes. We've got a famous painting there called Follow Me by H. Charles McBaron Jr. that pictures Colonel Aubrey S. Newman leading the 3rd Battalion of the 35th U.S. Army Infantry Regiment across Red Beach, Leyte, the Philippine Islands on October 20th, 1944. And that was a heroic charge led by Newman there. Great hero. Next, highlight victory in the Pacific. And I will say that if you'd like to read more about Newman, I'd really encourage you to look him up. And he was quite a guy. All right, so victory in the Pacific. Highlight B-29s and submarines. Highlight at the beginning of 1945, Japan had clearly lost the war. Highlight B-29 raids against industries, and highlight submarine attacks against shipping. We're on the top of page 396 now. Highlight the B-29 Superfortress bombers. Highlight that they were bombing Japan's major cities on a daily basis. It was inspiring terror in the people and causing a lot of destruction. At the end of that paragraph, highlight American submarines had sunk 167 Japanese warships and 1,089 merchant vessels. Next, highlight Iwo Jima. Highlight that U.S. Marines landed on Iwo Jima in February 1945. Highlight that over 6,000 Marines were killed, along with all 20,000 Japanese defenders. All 20,000 of them chose to die rather than surrender. And I want you to remember that as we're talking in just a few minutes about the atomic bombs. 20,000 men chose to die rather than surrender. Down at the bottom of the page, we have the statue at Iwo Jima of the raising of the flag of Mount Suribachi. And that, of course, is from a very, very famous photograph that was taken there. And it says that it depicts U.S. Marines, but actually there was a soldier and at least one naval man in there as well. And if you would like to read a little bit more about them, you can read the book Flags of Our Fathers. And that tells a little bit about the Battle of Iwo Jima. Next, highlight Okinawa. The Battle of Okinawa was extremely intense, one of the worst battles of the war. Okinawa is the main island of the Ryukyus. It's just about 350 miles from the Japanese homeland. Highlight, top of the second column, that U.S. troops suffered 45,000 casualties. Highlight that the Japanese sacrificed their largest battleship, the Yamato, in a suicide run against the entire American fleet, as well as 5,000 kamikazes. So highlight all of that. And of course, the kamikazes were suicide planes loaded with explosives. They would just aim their airplanes straight at the side of an American ship and drive into it. Highlight that about 12,000 Americans were dead, 36,000 wounded, and all 100,000 Japanese were killed. All 100,000. Now, I have here a bullet casing that I found in a cave on the coast of Okinawa. And the caves that are there, the cave that I found this in had a memorial set up, and they had a walled off portion that had human bones behind it. And the Okinawan people fled to the caves in order to avoid the Americans, because the Japanese soldiers had told them that the Americans were monsters, that they would eat them, that they would kill their children, things like that, and they believed them because they didn't know any better. And the cliffs that are there on the southern part of the island that they were driven to, they're known as the Suicide Cliffs. And families, fathers, the heads of the families, would take their children and their wives, and they would force them to jump off the cliffs with them because they truly believed that that was better than being taken by the Americans. In many cases, when the Japanese soldiers were hiding in the caves with the Okinawan people, they would shoot the entire cave full of people before killing themselves as well to prevent them from surrendering. And it was a tragic time, senseless loss of life, and over 100,000 Japanese defenders of the island were killed because they simply refused to surrender. And there's a memorial there now. It's called the Peace Memorial Museum, and it's a token of those whose lives were lost there, and it's a celebration of the peace that now exists between the two nations. And it's quite a place to visit. I went there a couple times. So the Battle of Okinawa, all in all, one of the bloodiest and most intense battles of the war. Next, highlight the Potsdam Declaration. Highlight that President Roosevelt was reelected to a fourth term, but highlight on April 12th, 1945, he died. Very unexpectedly of a stroke. He'd been very sickly for a long time. Never should have run for a third or fourth election. But he did, and he died. So highlight Vice President Harry S. Truman. Became president. Highlights in 1945, Truman, Stalin, and Clement Attlee, that's the new British Prime Minister, met in Potsdam, Germany. So 1945, Truman, Joseph Stalin, Clement Attlee met in Potsdam, Germany. It's called the Potsdam Conference. During this time, Churchill's Conservative Party was defeated by the Labour Party, and Clement Attlee became the Prime Minister. Highlight this date, July 26, 1945. Highlight the Potsdam Declaration, and highlight that it called upon the Japanese to surrender unconditionally and to withdraw to the home islands. This promised that the Japanese would neither be enslaved nor destroyed, but the Japanese fanatics and militarists refused to heed it, and they continued to fight. They insisted that all of the Japanese people would rather die than submit. So they were willing to sacrifice their entire nation of people to avoid surrender.